Good morning, everyone. It's Kim from Permaculture Australia here, introducing our monthly video interview series. We've got a fantastic lineup of people here today. Some you may recognise from the Australia permaculture scene, as well as some new guests as well, who have some fantastic stories to share as well. The world has changed immeasurably over the last 30 years, with more, bigger, better being the common mantra. But in the midst of this constantly evolving world, there is a growing community of people who are looking at our history, searching for answers to issues that are faced everywhere at the moment in our world in Australia, as well as internationally as well. I'm really thrilled to introduce firstly Su Dennett and Virginia Solomon, give us a wave ladies, who have been living and promoting a sustainable household and community activities at Immeasurably, an eco-resilient household in Melbourne and in Victoria. Their activities are vast and include the Hepburn Relocalisation Network, Permaculture Australia, Holmgren Design, Permaculture Education, just to name a few. Both Virginia, Su and David Holmgren, who's also on the screen, have all visited Japan several times and met Azby, who's also joining the interview today. And we're looking forward to a discussion with all four members about their time in Japan, as well as links between two very fantastic books, which I'll let Su Dennett introduce more now. But before I hand over to Su, just a brief acknowledgement to country. I'm acknowledging the traditional owners of the land of which we're all meeting on. I'm in Lutruwita, Tasmania, and acknowledging the traditional owners past, present and emerging. But thanks, Su, over to you, and really looking forward to the interview.
Good morning, and a very good morning to you, Azby. I've been waiting for a long time for a meeting with you. It's such a delight. I want to introduce you first because you're such a novelty to me, and I'm sure to those who will be watching and listening, whereas many more people are familiar with our friend David Holmgren here. So, Azby, you're not Japanese, which surprised me greatly when I read your book, and I know that you're from the States, and but now that you're in the architecture department in Tokyo. Can you tell me a bit about your going to Japan first of all?
Yes. I'm from the United States, as you mentioned. I'm from New Orleans in Louisiana in the South, which is a fairly old town, rather a city that has maintained a lot of its older, urban structures and buildings, et cetera, and sort of grew up with very comfortable with the idea that we're going to continue to use buildings that may be a century old or older, that it will grow and change and evolve with us. I did university at Yale College and went into architecture and fine art. And got very interested in Japan when I was in university, particularly garden design and carpentry. So maybe Japanese carpentry is this beautifully sophisticated craft, which has also evolved over a millennium or so. I mean, some initial input from continental Asia, from China, et cetera, but it's beautiful craft, and I wanted to learn about that, and was fortunate to be able to come to Japan and meet the last great temple carpenter, whose name was Tsunekazu Nishioka. And, I didn't expect to be here 35 years, which is I've been here, since 1985. But that was so interesting to me. And I ended up writing a book about it. I was fortunate. I initially thought I wanted to be an apprentice and learn that. But then I sort of thought of my own temperament. At the time I was 28 or so, and I was already doing my own creative work. And this idea of, being totally obedient to this master for 8 years, I thought I would fail at that. And I said, instead, let me just document your work. Let me have access to your site. And that turned into 3 years on site at this temple construction project, and turned into a book called The Genius of Japanese Carpentry. And that sort of put me on this trajectory. And one thing that, I want to point out is that as I would talk to the carpenter, the master, about, why do you do this or why do you do that? His conversation would always come back to issues of the environment, always come back to issues of time, of longevity, of, you know, the brevity of human life in comparison to 1,000-year lifespan of a tree or a temple that's in use for 1,000 years. And, you know, just talking about trees, I mean, we think, from my background, let's say as an American, and mainly in Western culture, to be like a good carpenter means the dimensions are right and the finish is nice. But for a Japanese carpenter, that's the least common denominator. I mean, that doesn't even make you a carpenter. A good carpenter understands the wood, understands the tree, how it grew, where it lived, how it's changed during that time, and how it's going to change after you cut it and put it in a building. And then again, looking at those changes over the span of centuries. So for me, that was really the remarkable thing. He would talk about, you know, where was the wind, where was the sun? And there was a lot of what they call rules of thumb, traditional ways of choosing wood depending on where it was on the mountain, etc. And that was really eye-opening to me. And as I spent more time in Japan talking with other craftspeople, maybe working in lacquer or something else, they all had the same sensibility, and it had been handed down to them and was still a living tradition. So this was really, you know, a wonderful and rich, you know, world for me to become aware of. At the same time, I was very interested in urban Japan, in contemporary Japan, in how it was utilizing or maximizing this terrible lack of resources, particularly lack of space for building, for instance. And I started to research compact housing. And, you know, how do they make this very small footprint housing, and what are the efficiencies and benefits of that? And of course, it's a very industrial process, but it leads to some really good efficiencies. And I was invited to speak at a sustainability conference in Sun Valley. And I want to think that was maybe 2005 or so. And at that time, that was also eye-opening. They wanted me to talk about compact housing, and all the others were like, here's someone working with, you know, prairie restoration by, you know, having cattle or bison roam and stomp their poop into the earth. And here's someone dealing with water issues. Here's someone dealing with forestry. Here's someone dealing with agriculture. Here's someone dealing with waste flows. And they were all speaking the same language. And all saying, oh, we should hook up on that. Oh, we should hook up on this. Oh, I need to know more about that. And there was a sense that, you know, there was a shared body of knowledge, and they were finally able to sort of make this complete circle out of that. And I thought, wow, these people might like to know about Japan. And that is really what kicked off my research into the Edo period sustainable practices of Japan. So it was really this inspiration by the sustainability community, people I came into contact with in the early 2000s in the United States. To put it briefly.
To put it briefly, yeah. So I think, David, you will be known to a lot of people here, but what is it that then in Azby's history is similar to your history?
Well, there's some interesting similarities in that we've been at Meliadora on 2¼ acres in what might be called a farm in Japan, but it's just sort of like a large backyard in Australia, and involved in managing the larger catchment, involved in woodworking. I'm a woodworker too, and we're
not Japanese.
There's a story about that actually. When Sue had come back from work, and I was looking at some resolution of the intersection between mud brick wall and timber ceiling, and this is timber that we'd been involved in salvage harvesting from the great 1983 bushfires. And she gave me the thumbs down on this.
What's that bit of wood up there?
Helmet board covering. She said she wanted the mud brick wall to go straight to the ceiling. Anyway, I complied with that. There was some other point where she made some suggestion that was quite technically difficult. And I said, you'll need to get yourself a Japanese carpenter.
I had some serious thoughts about that.
But of course, one of my mentors, who I regard as one of my mentors in permaculture after Bill Mollison, was Hakai Tane in in New Zealand, and his name is an adopted name, and that guy is Japanese name, of course. Tane is Horus of the Maori mythology, and I remember his lessons about ecological history of Japan and contained culture and the respect for the mountain forests, which had endured through even the extremes of the industrialized empire expanding phase after the Edo period. He attributed to, and I can't even remember when he was saying whether it was the 14th century or a period when there was massive loss of forest in Japan and the destruction and degradation of the lowlands, and then the husbanding back on these limited islands, that deeply embedded in the culture, this what we would call sustainability today, and that elements of that have persisted into the modern era, that while Japanese corporations have been involved in raping forests in Southeast Asia and Australia and other places, that in my observations in rural Japan in 2004, and being in the heart of some of the biggest industrial forestry areas in Kyushu, it was more like boutique, small-scale, sustainable forestry by comparison to North American or Australian forestry. So, yeah, a lot of crossovers there. And of course, it was interesting also when Su Dennett and I got together. She had all of these influences from having lived in southern Italy for 11 years, traditional peasant Italian food culture, but she was also very much into macrobiotics and Japanese culture. And gradually I gained that she had this lifelong interest in Japanese culture. So a lot of what we have done here has been that fusion of my permaculture vision and her influences that have been one of which has been Japanese traditional culture in food and other things.
Azby, in hearing you talk about your introduction to Japan and your whole journey, it felt like I was going down a tunnel into Japan myself, because in a way it feels like it was in a past life of mine being Japanese, and I had a bit that experience, although not feeling of going into the tunnel because I was in Japan. I had a feeling of coming home, and I think that's very much at the basis of where I'm coming from in my desire for simplicity and interconnectedness. And so with you, why did you choose the Edo period? What was the history leading up to that period that resulted in the Edo period doing what they did?
Yeah, I think David touched on this a moment ago. There was a time before the Edo period, that begins like around 1600, 1603 or so, and lasts until 1868, when the country opened to the West and began industrialization. So it was 250 years or more. Prior to that was a period of great wars and this sort of expansionist policy on the part of the government. They were invading Korea. They were hoping to conquer China. There was lots of overseas trade and lots of economic activity there. But they basically deforested the country for building cities, building castles, building ships, building all of these things, and it was leading to basically an environmental collapse. Of course, one of the first things that happens when you lose the forest is you lose your watershed, and when you lose a watershed, well, then you have these uncontrolled floods, and when you have uncontrolled floods, then you're destroying your agriculture, and just this dominoes just collapsing. But, you know, there were some very, very, you know, good thinkers then, people who understood what was going on and well-placed in government in certain areas and said, wait a minute, we have to stop this. You know, the first thing we have to do is bring back the forests. And they developed regenerative forestry. So I was looking, you know, at these sort of issues, and having been in Japan a long time and being interested in traditional culture, you know, I would hear a lot of, you know, let's say anecdotes about how people lived in the Edo period. Oh, they recycled everything, or they, you know, were doing very efficient agriculture, or they were using human waste for fertilizer, or all sorts of things like that. You know, these sort of disconnected anecdotes. And I thought, well, you know, I'd like to really find out more about it. And of course, I had studied a lot of architecture and building and carpentry and those aspects until then. I said, well, yeah, but what about what happens before you get on site to build a building? Where's that wood coming from? And where's the other materials coming from? And how's it being used? And what happens to it afterward? And trying to build, you know, this picture of this entire network of things, of flows and of material and of energy and of people. So it turned out, and the more I got into it, I said, wow, this is really a model of sustainability that we can learn from. And I stress to people, you know, I'm not saying we should go back to using the same materials and the same technology. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the understanding of how things are interconnected, which was not theorized in the way you people have done in permaculture. It's not a theoretical, you know, measured sort of scientific thing. It was, you know, passed down and experiential, and over generations and generations, they figured out what worked. And one, you know, sort of phrase that I often use when I talk about it is, you know, we have the expression to kill two birds with one stone. And almost all of the solutions that I saw Japanese had developed, whether it's in agriculture or planning or architecture or energy or whatever, was killing 5 birds with one stone. The solutions that approach and help solve the most problems ended up being the most enduring solutions. So that to me is the key lesson. Having to understand how things are connected, and how what you do here is going to influence in something on the other side, and know how you try to visualize how you can use these in a mutually reinforcing way. And again, this was not so purely theorized in the Edo period, but if you look at what they were doing and you sort of break it down and analyze it, you see how they work. And I have to say, I learned a lot reading, you know, David's work on permaculture, and reading more about permaculture was actually very instructive to me to understand what Japanese were doing, let's say in agriculture. In terms of what you talk about as edge conditions and the importance of looking at where systems connect. So I said, yeah, that's exactly what they were doing. So I understand the history. I understand there was a lot of learning from Japan involved in your work. And we can go back to farmers of 40 centuries, you know, but by Mr. King, I suppose, in the early 20th century. And there's a lot of, you know, ideas from there. But finally, you know, the Edo period really was the place where that all came together and lasted for 250 years in a very stable method with a constantly improving quality of life. You know, this is just, you know, the thing we think about. The hardest thing to persuade people about, as you know, you've been doing this your entire life, is they think they're going to have to suffer or do without or somehow have a worse quality of life if they embrace these principles. But it's not true. And the Edo period just shows that so clearly.
Yeah, very much so. So your book, Just Enough, which I didn't show in the beginning, but I would like to now. When we got the copy of this book from Virginia, very kindly sent by you, signed, I was really quite surprised just how in-depth it all was. When did this first come out, Azby? Your book?
I want to say 2009 or 2010.
Yep.
This was, you know, shortly before the disaster in 2011, and the Japanese edition came out literally a few weeks before the disaster in 2011. And I suddenly had a huge interest from Japanese, let's say, media and people and organizations and even government people in that. So it was about a 5-year project, research project. And yes, it just my personality and again, temperament, I'm kind of a completist. And, you know, once I get into it, I want to talk about all the details. So, and this was a perfect subject for that kind of, mindset.
Yeah, yeah. And in effect, I see that your book is divided into the 3 parts: field and forest, a sustainable city, and a life of restraint. And you, a little bit like in David's book, Retrosuburbia, his is divided into sections in a bit of a similar way, but you both have very strong focus on the storytelling of the life of a particular period, as well as all the resources that are needed. And you go through each thing that we can relate to on a day-to-day basis, which I think has been missing so much in all histories that you read. You're not getting the little man's life and detail. And I think that's what's so boring in history for us older people, how we learned history in school. It had no relation to what you do on your daily, from when you get up to when you go to bed, and what your life might be in a particular area, like as a carpenter. So I can see why you thought that, permaculture had a natural place in Japanese hearts and society. But I think that in terms of an historical look at a society, we can also see this in Australia, that in looking back, we look at our own history, and we are a very young nation, but our native peoples are the oldest possibly in the world. So we need also to always go back to that, and we can see how the Japanese, actually traditional things, can inform us a little bit on how we learn from our own peoples in Australia. So for NAIDOC Week, we're absolutely celebrating that. Can you tell me a little bit about the samurai and the daimyo estates? I think that that's an area that will scare a lot of people. They might identify with a lot of the things that permaculture and the Edo period have in common in many areas, but this one I think will scare a lot of people. Tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, well, first I want to totally agree with you about the importance of storytelling. And what I ended up doing, as I had all this research material, just files and files and, copies and copies and things. And okay, how am I going to string this together? And I just had, at one point it came to me as a brainstorm to make a travelogue, because I learn by traveling, and we spoke earlier about traveling through Japan and going to small villages and seeing what's going on. And I love walking through cities. So I said, let's just approach it as a travelogue where you encounter people and see what the people are doing and how they're relating, because all this involves human relations and finding people to work together, or having these shared values, or feeling the constraints of social responsibility or whatever. So that was really, for me, the way to tell the story. And one of the big points was the life of samurai in Japan, and certainly in the Edo period. It was a feudal society. Like, if there's a pyramid population-wise, the farmers were the largest. 80% of the population were farmers, and they actually had a fairly high status. They had a higher status than merchants. The businessmen. They were considered, under this Confucian, as a Confucian society, under the Confucian value system, they were working for money, which was not really very moral. So they're kind of low on the totem pole in terms of status, but of course they ended up getting all the money. And samurai were at the top, and they were a fairly, their life was very constrained by moral principles and principles of responsibility. A chief among them was restraint. And the need to avoid unnecessary consumption, the need to demonstrate constantly, preparedness as a warrior, preparedness to support the leader, and the leaders were the daimyo. These were feudal lords. So each, what we now would call prefectures or states, these were dominions, and they each had a lord. There was about 200 of them throughout the nation during this period. And they were united into this political coalition led by the Tokugawa shoguns, who were based in Edo. And Edo was this big city at this point with, over 1.3 million people, big city by any, standards. And because of this hierarchy, the samurai were able to use most of the land for living. And the townspeople sort of squeezed into the worst land. But the samurai had these beautiful homesteads in the city, as did the daimyo, the lords. They had these big estates, and they had to have 3 of them. And they were partly like, military headquarters, so they'd have a kind of a large block of property, and they had some big buildings in there, which were theoretically residences, but there's offices and barracks for soldiers, and some gardens, including vegetable gardens. And the samurai, again, they're using 60% of the land in the city, and they had a house and a wall and a garden. Initially, this was an ornamental garden, but of course, even at the beginning, they would plant trees that were growing fruit, for instance, and providing food and providing other environmental services, windbreaks, shade. This was very, very well designed stuff. As time went on, they started to sort of go broke because they were on fixed stipends. And you'd be a samurai, you're lower middle class guy, basically. You're a cleric. Your job is to go to the office and stamp papers. And then, you're only getting the same income your grandfather did, and there's inflation. So they started to have a bad lifestyle, and they started converting their ornamental gardens into urban food gardens. And this was widespread. This became simply the thing. So they would keep a corner with the pond and the fish and the stuff, but then they'd have these big urban gardens. And it's interesting because although they were the elite and they were educated, and this is one of the things, there's a very high literacy in Japan, but these people had a more developed, a more thorough education. They were kind of intellectuals. So you think about, the gentleman farmer. They're reading books. Publishing is very well developed. They would get a book. Oh, look at these wonderful, kabocha is, pumpkins. Which ones are we going to grow this year? Or look at these wonderful eggplant. Let's choose which one we're going to grow this year. And they would, there was a bit of competition and who's going to have the best eggplants, etc. The other thing is that this became an alternate economy, a very important economy for the samurai. They're technically prohibited from working for money. Their income that they get from the government is based on rice, which they then sell and convert to money to pay their household needs. But they would circulate their surplus amongst each other and amongst their networks as a kind of circular economy. And this was a beautiful thing. So they would grow, you got a surplus of eggplant this year, and your cousin, down the street, he's got more apples than he needs. And there's this custom in Japan, it's called susowake, of distributing surplus. And this was an important economic system for them. So you had sort of these 3 economic systems overlaid. You had the rice, value system, you had some cash money, and then you had this circulation of surplus. And this was something fantastic that the samurai did. And no one really said, we're going to design a system that, fulfills everybody's needs in a way that's economically and environmentally sustainable. No one thought that out, but it evolved and developed and persisted again for 100 years or more. So that was one of the interesting things about the samurai. We could talk about the architecture, the houses, samurai. When we think of the beautiful Japanese house, of course, there's fantastic farmhouses and others, but you think of these beautiful tatami mat room with the tokonoma shelf and, the screens open on the side to a beautiful veranda, and there's a beautiful garden out there. That is basically a samurai house. That's basically called a zashiki. And this ideal, again, it was perfected 500 years ago, and you can go into one now and feel perfectly comfortable, and it's actually still very livable. And in terms of energy use, what we would say it's an ideal prototype for passive solar architecture in many ways. It is just, comfortable in most seasons and uses materials beautifully. And the use of the materials, the wood and the clay and the tatami, help with this sort of modulation of the interior environment, etc. So there's just a lot of beautiful things that happen in the life of samurai, mainly driven by their need for restraint and to avoid consumption and being involved in a cash economy.
So David, the samurai class in Australia, tell me a bit more about that. What do we do about them? Are they kind of got the right values or not?
Well,
are they, you know, are they constrained by anything?
Well, obviously, society in the West is a lineage built on perpetual growth and expansion, which we could say really came out of Europe hitting ecological limits 500 years ago, getting to North America where 90% of the population died at contact, and getting 2 continents of free resources, which gave the build-up in economic and organisational complexity to tap the really big one, which was fossil fuel. So we've been on this sort of unlimited growth trajectory for 500 years at least. We can trace it back and see parallels to it in earlier civilizations, and there's been hiccups along the way, including world wars and the Great Depressions, the 1890s depression and the 1930s, but that trajectory has been very much focused on maximising growth, maximising expansion, and breaking the bounds of constraint. And I think through that period, there's been various cycles of recognition of those problems that, including the Romantic movement against the excesses of industrialization, through to utopian back to the land movements, through to the development of organic agriculture and this reaction to the adverse effects of modernity, but also recognition of the limits to growth. And of course, that was the name of the report in 1972 to the Club of Rome, that industrial civilization continuing on its path would hit fundamental limits sometime in the middle of the 21st century that it could not work around unless it radically restructured itself around some sort of steady state, some sort of notion of enough. So that modern environmentalism has brought up over the decades a whole series of responses to try and work within nature's limits, including permaculture is obviously
so you think
one of those.
You think the evolution, you know, into the Edo period is happening, but how many years did that take to kind of get to that steady state where we've got just enough and we can all exist?
It's fascinating, you know, issues that you're raising here. First of all, it was rooted in customary practices that had gone back generations, centuries, even millennium, you know, in Japan. Basically, how do you approach farming? How do you approach these things? It just became rather more systemized and integrated, partly because of the growth of the urban areas and their needs for, you know, things and food, etc. You know, in terms of reversing the deforestation, I would say probably within about 50 years, that's about how long it takes to grow, right? You know, a forest. They had stabilized things, and this was done through one of the few instances of clear legal, measures that included strict penalties for cutting trees, etc. They said, no, you're going to protect these forests, and literally a death penalty for going into certain forests with an axe. You know, your forests are considered so important. It took about 50 years for that. But I think what is interesting is that the Edo period really was a time where the central government and society in general embraced an anti-growth economy. It says, no, we are not going to go try to achieve the kind of growth that we were aiming for in the previous decades, the previous time, where they were expansionist and trying to get resources. He said, because that didn't work, and we nearly wiped out our own, you know, environment and et cetera. And it became an anti-growth period. And there were some thinkers who actually formulated that as an anti-consumption ethic. And it was centered in these, again, Confucian notions of good governance. What is a good ruler? What does a good ruler provide for his subjects? And it included, of course, you know, security and a good life and adequate food, etc. And so it does not include lots of consumption. You know, you don't have to have lots of consumption or consumption just in order to make the economic, you know, wheels go around. People need what they need, and they need to. These things need to be imbued with meaning and significance as human beings living a meaningful life, which means really upholding certain values and upholding society, etc. So it really was anti-growth. And again, they didn't formulate it in the way that we formulated it in our own economic thinking, but it was clear. They said, no, we're not going to try to achieve that anymore. We're going to do what we can with what we have. And we're going to figure out how to use that the best. In something like energy, again, you know, there was not a fossil fuel based, you know, energy system at all, but it was based on wood, like every place. And they said, well, you know, we need the trees. We have to preserve the trees. So we need to limit the use of wood for fuel wherever possible. And in some cases, this was clearly formulated. In other places, it was just natural outcome of the value and the need to preserve wood. So at every place in the society, the use of wood for fuel was minimized as much as possible. So this, you know, again, leads to great innovations in design. How do you design your wood stove, your cook stove? If you're going to boil water, what's that going to change? This evolution of Japanese bathhouses, which are still beautiful, the sento, you know, where you go in and, you know, have, you know, 20 people sitting in this huge hot bath. This was a naturally evolved, you know, maximization of fuel. And to have, as you know, hot water available for as many people as possible to bathe in without wasting the fuel. So this happened throughout the society, and fuel and energy was one of the keys to that.
That's very exciting. It sort of takes us over also into the Retrosuburbia situation too, where you're trying to illustrate better use of resources and community involvement in those.
Yeah, well, Retrosuburbia has a number of parallels. I suppose it's first starting at that bottom of people saying, what have we got? Where are we? And of course, where most Australians are is in something that we would call suburbia, whether it's in large capital cities or small or medium-sized towns, that people living on a distinct house on some small parcel of land and making maximum efficient use of that space. And of course, bringing as much as possible, that being a food-producing environment and a home economy, which is also the basis of a community, initially non-monetary economy, a bit like you were saying about the samurai economy. And there's a parallel there, because most people do work in the monetary economy, but in the Retrosuburbia paradigm, we're looking at reducing that from 2 people working full-time on the treadmill to how do we downscale, how do we reduce the need for money and partly compensate for that by reducing our demands, but also by building the household and through that the community, neighbourhood, non-monetary economy of exchange and reciprocity and self-reliance, obviously, so you don't need as much money, and to make better, more efficient use of the buildings we've already got that are the largest houses in terms of square meters per person of any houses in the world, well, we could actually fit more people in those houses, sharing those houses, taking in a border, and also pushing the kids out into the street to play in the street again rather than being inside the house. How do we make better use of what we've got? There's another connection, of course, in where we're talking about medium scale history of the Edo period, and then deep history of indigenous cultural use of this continent going back tens of thousands of years. But Retrosuburbia, of course, also involves this recent history of my Aussie street story of how people lived in suburbia as recently as our childhood. And that, I suppose, in growing up in those suburbs in the 60s, by the time I was an early teenager, I'd come to the perspective that this was probably the most wasteful, extravagant way of life for a mainstream population that had ever been created on the planet. But by the 1990s, in permaculture design courses, I was teaching that maybe the suburbs of the 50s and 60s might be a model of sustainability that we could aspire to, because we'd gone so far in the wrong direction since then. So that I was turning it around and saying, okay, just our own recent past has some signs and ways in which we can relatively easily reconstruct some of the things we need to do without needing to say we need to go to a blank slate world and with permaculture design vision, design everything from scratch. So it is that hybrid. And then of course the other element that is key in Australia is that so many of the creative elements in Retrosuburbia have actually come from migrant cultures. And in our part of the world, a lot of that we would associate with people from the Mediterranean, partly because they came from often peasant farming backgrounds, but also because of their ways of growing food naturally worked in our climate because it was the same climate. More recently, we've had large numbers of people from Asian cultures, and sure, there's some of that has taken root as well, but better in Brisbane than in Melbourne because of, you know, climatic connections. So we see all of that multicultural contribution and that learning, similarly, like we're talking about the influence of Japanese culture and actual elements that we use in our permaculture systems here, and whether that's you know, daikon radish or futons on the roll-up, futons on the floor, that permaculture's always involved this eclectic adopting useful parts of traditional cultures from wherever they are and acknowledging those as sources and inspirations for permaculture. And certainly Retrosuburbia is doing that, but it's going back to even our relatively recent Aussie culture and saying, gee, there must be something useful in this.
Yeah. You're going to respond.
I was just going to say, you're touching on so many really interesting points. One is this importance of what we consider to be indigenous knowledge for things like agriculture or environmental, you know, management, and the fact that ultimately we're all rooted in some indigenous culture somehow, and yet they've always been cross-pollinating. And we see it more visibly now with our ages of travel. And I'm from Louisiana. After the Vietnam War, there was a large influx of people from Southeast Asia who brought practices and farming and fishing, et cetera, and merged in a beautiful way with local culture and became part of local culture as well. Also, you touched on, you know, what I'm thinking of as sort of informal urbanism, informal cities. You know, we see this in beautiful places all around the world, whether it's in Africa or Latin America, possibly in your region as well. The sort of places where governance doesn't really reach in terms of, you know, building codes and things, and they're very innovative, and maybe they're substandard, maybe there's some danger, you know, to things falling down sometimes, but actually very innovative and creative and totally maximizing space and maximizing resources. So there's a lot for us to learn from there. But in terms of suburbia, it's really fascinating to me because a lot of it has to do with population growth, doesn't it? And we have this interesting phenomenon happening now in Japan. You're probably aware of it. It's an aging society. The birth rate is declining. And the Tokyo city government issued a report maybe more than 5 years ago saying they predict that the population of Tokyo will decrease by half by the end of this century, which is stunning. Of course, this means decreasing from 14 million to 7 million. That's still a lot of people. But what it means urbanistically is there's this huge band of suburbs, what we call bed towns, right, that surround Tokyo, that were farms in the immediate wartime period and immediate post-war, and turned into suburbs, residential areas, because of this massive population growth and economic growth. And those are emptying out now. They're now starting to empty out. A huge, you know, problem with abandoned homes. No one wants to buy them. If they're going to get a place, they want to live in the city or closer. So I think we're going to see this sort of hollowing out. It's already beginning of these huge swaths of land around the city centers, dotted with islands of dense urbanism. Let's say the 30-minute train ride distance, that'll be dense, you know, several places around there. And I'm thinking, well, what you're talking about with this retrosuburbia is a very applicable model for what can and probably should happen with these depopulating suburbs around Tokyo, not just Tokyo, other cities. Now, I made proposals, for grants to study this, saying, you know, I'm looking at what does planned depopulation look like? You know, what does it look like? And what are the examples? And there's very few. And I said, we should study that and plan this, because otherwise it could develop in a very chaotic and poor way. And literally, people, the government grant making body, they said, this is not a worthwhile idea. I mean, they didn't even want to think about it, which is depressing. So he didn't get the grant. But I think it is necessary. On the other hand, as we know, people come up with their own solutions. If you leave them alone, you know, they'll come up with good solutions. So I think we're going to see it happening regardless. But I can imagine living in suburban Tokyo 10, 15, 20 years from now could be really nice in terms of having urban farming, being a little more self-sufficient, better energy, maybe more independent energy systems. Japan is blessed with a fantastic public transportation system. These things can be maximized as well. So the point is we need models for that. And perhaps Retrosuburbia, your ideas really are applicable for that. And I did look at them when I was writing my book, to be honest, and referred to them when I was thinking about this grant as well. So there you go.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I see the crossover also with the relatively chaotic, unplanned examples that like Detroit and some of the Rust Belt towns.
Detroit is a great example of unplanned downsizing, catastrophic downsizing, right?
Yeah.
New Orleans,
and then that leading to more urban agriculture and salvage of, multiple buildings. Most of these buildings are coming down, but here we can keep and salvage and keep these ones and open up land around that. So you've got a ruralization, but not a sort of like we need to wipe this off the map, that it can evolve down. Now, obviously, those examples have not been through highly desirable processes, but they at least show some of the organic process by which urban agriculture can reinvigorate some of those places.
Yeah, I think that also with governments not rising to the challenge and various bureaucracies, I don't think all is lost, because I think we also need to remember the power of the individual and the individual collectivized, and that those changes, wherever they be in the world, are always on the edge of society, and that they eventually do influence places and what people do. So I'm just wondering, going right back to the detail of things rather than to be at the top and looking at the global, which is great because we've gone down into specialisation so much in our societies that I think that's to our detriment now. We're not looking at the whole. But going back again to the individual household, you know, the things that we do here on the property and how we, for example, grow the food in the garden that's fairly close to the house, and then that comes in and we prepare inside. Wood cooking, I love wood cooking. And we have a very large stove. We have bought recently, a year or so ago, this very large stove. But a very large stove means a very lot of people to be eating to be justified. How was it in Edo, Japan, in both cities and more rural town sort of places?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that fuel was, needed to be used as efficiently as possible, and that meant that designs for cooking evolved along very efficient lines. Now, there are sort of two areas of a Japanese house. So let's talk about a farmhouse. Particularly, there is a cooking area, which would be a clay cook stove, which would have generally 2 or sometimes more fireboxes of different sizes. And then the pots were made to fit into these openings, circular openings, very snugly, so they would be down into the firebox and preventing any leakage of the heat. And that could be, they could choose, depending on how much they needed to cook and what, how much fuel they wanted to use, and then choose the firebox that was appropriate for that. And it was very modular, and you could put steamers on them, or you could put other attachments on them, etc. Then there was the hearth, called the irori, which was more like a fire pit. And the interesting thing is that it is not that different than sort of a prehistoric fire pit, with maybe nice wood surround, etc., and ways to suspend things from the top. But particularly in colder climates, this was kind of the center of family life. People would sit around the fire pit, and that was the center of communication and everything. And certain foods would be cooked there as well, especially a lot of things that needed to be. You could just have like fish on a stick, near the coals, and it would be they would be cooking, etc. Or you could put a pot of water in there to boil to make tea, etc. And they took more fuel. They required more fuel than the cook stove called the kamado that I was mentioning. It's a very efficient stove, which could basically burn anything. I mean, this is the thing. You could put your old straw sandals in there. You could put leaves. You could put whatever you needed, to make food with. But the other thing is that these were part of a system. Once the fuel is burned, then they're keeping the ash, they're preserving the embers, they're preserving all this stuff, and then reusing that. That goes back into certain feeds. I mean, some of it could be agricultural use, some could be, to go to ceramics or maybe to metal making, etc. So there was this constant, drive to discover uses for the byproducts of this whole system. So the fire, has always been in most cultures the center of family life, and this was, in the case of Japan, evolved into a very, very beautiful, comfortable, and in a way very efficient, source of heat for the home. To double to that, for instance, a samurai house, they may have had a fire pit, in the kitchen, but in many walks of life, people would just have this small little brazier, this little, either a pot, there could be ceramic, it may be metal, just to heat right where they're sitting, in the winter. and they'd wear like very warm, thick, quilted kimonos and stuff, and they would sit right there, and they'd have the heat right next to them, and you'd sit close to that, and you could move that around. If you want to sit in the sun, you can move that around depending on where the sun was. And this idea of heating the whole room was sort of anathema for that thinking. And that has actually influenced the Japanese approach to heating homes to this day, where, the heaters are generally space heaters, limited to, you only turn them on in the place where people are sitting. So this is still a kind of efficiency that people expect.
What about bedrooms, for example?
Beg your pardon?
What about bedrooms and sleeping?
Yeah, this wonderful thing about Japanese home design is that it's very flexible. And in some cases, a certain room would be set aside, and you knew that's where people are going to be sleeping. But the bedding, and I think you yourselves use futons. Futons are expected to be folded up and put out of the way every day. And if you're particularly in the case of urban homes, and in my book, we visit a carpenter living in what we call a tenement. It doesn't mean it's a slum, but a very small one-room apartment for a family, and it would be about 6 mats, so it's not that very big, but everything would be put out. It was all mobile furnishings, and things could be put away, and the house that one room was used for everything. They're sleeping, and then you put it away, and then they're going to sit there and have their breakfast, and they're going to put it away. They'll be working in there, they'll be studying in there, and it's all done in the same room, because the furnishings and everything they're using is compact, and can be folded away and somehow moved out of the way. So this was just a very fundamental need for Japanese home design since this period, and even before, which still influences home designs today. You go to a Japanese home center, it's amazing, the stuff that folds out of the way, and you can put your shirts and they disappear, and it's amazing the stuff that people do, and they sort of take it for granted even to today.
Yeah, the tiny house movement, I think, has drawn a lot on Japan. Yeah. And
yeah, I think so. And I was writing about that in the 1980s, right? And then there became another book, right before the Just Enough book. And that was, again, maybe ahead of its time, which may be a good thing, maybe not a good thing. But yeah, I was really focusing on that and fascinated. And again, Japanese, this is one of the wonderful things, to be a foreigner developing this expertise and to be in a position to introduce those ideas outside while constantly being aware, well, I'm not Japanese, and who am I to try to represent this, but at the same time, people seem to be very aware that this is an important role. Someone needs to do that. Japanese culture, society accepts influence from outside, or will be more likely to change because someone outside has pointed to something happening, praising it, for instance. For me to say Japanese carpentry is great, or Japanese compact houses are great, or Japanese sustainability is great, then there's oh, look, the rest of the people outside of Japan think this is important. We should pay attention to it. And it's a little silly in a way, because there's so many people in Japan who are saying the same thing and have been saying the same thing for decades. And I could not do anything I'm doing without being able to benefit from their work. And I know that, and I know a lot of these people, and we work together. But it's ironic that the society is so susceptible or open, receptive, let's say, to outside influence on that. So that's kind of my role, and I welcome that role.
Well, I think that's an important one, and I had a sense of that when I was in Japan too, that to acknowledge as an outsider how much Japanese culture and design has been a huge influence on the West. I found people didn't actually even understand how great that was, apart from the sustainability lessons. And I found in the permaculture movement in Japan, there was this tension, and to some extent that was a creative tension between, is not just permaculture, but ecological thinking something that we need to import into Japan, or is it part of actually rediscovering our own history? And in fact, that crossover between those worlds were very much in permaculture networks, that, is these ideas coming from outside, modern ecological ideas, but that rediscovery, especially for a lot of young people, that, there's a not just a resonance, but a deeper well of knowledge and models. And it was something that I was actually asked by some people within the Permaculture Network to please emphasize that connection and importance of tradition, as I saw it as a great source.
Azby, what do they do with washing and poo?
Well, the poo part is really interesting because I touched on it earlier that human waste at one point was recognized as a valuable fertilizer for agriculture and began to be used. So we have to again look at this relationship between urban areas and rural areas, and of course all this food is being brought into the cities, etc. And one result of that is large quantities of human waste in this area with a large population. So if you were a landowner, let's say you have these apartments, and you have a public latrine there that everyone uses, to clean this out was, took money and it was a pain. And initially at the beginning of this period, you would have to pay someone to come and clean it out and cart it away, right? But over time, this need to increase agricultural production led to the search for better fertilizers. And initially they used what was called karashki, which you're very familiar with, which is green fertilizer. So basically just taking leaves and other offcuts, etc., composting it and using that. And that was actually pretty good. But then they discovered that, for instance, rapeseed, which is a very useful product, that the husks, after pressing for rapeseed oil, that was also a good fertilizer, but that was commercial. That needed to be bought. That was okay. And also sardines were similar. They would get sardines and would press them for oil, and then the remnants of that was a good fertilizer. And little by little, these are being introduced. And then, of course, human waste had always been used as a fertilizer. But little by little, the systems developed. The farmers surrounding Edo realized that there was this huge source of potential fertilizer then. So they started to come, and initially they would say, we'll clean it out for free, if you just let us take it. And then a little later, they would say, let's make sure we can come clean this out next year and for the next 5 years, okay? And then they started to say, okay, we will pay you to let us clean it out. And then this developed to this entire economy of human waste with brokers and these long-term contracts between the farmers of this village and this neighborhood of Edo, these particular landowners, and developed an economy with sort of standardized, buckets and transportation systems, etc. And we think of this, these days, we have a lot of concerns for pathogens, parasites, etc. And on the good side, this was hot composted. It killed most pathogens. We're not aware of any huge health problems that arose from that. And we think, wow, it'd be great to do that. I tell people, it's as if you had your composting toilet at home, and then every month or so, someone comes and gives you $5 and carts off what's inside.
Well, nobody's getting my poo, I tell you.
Yeah. But of course, yeah, but here's the thing, as you know, the reason that it's very difficult and probably risky to try to implement this kind of system on a wide, on a large scale now, is because of pharmaceuticals. Because so many people are consuming pharmaceuticals, and this is in that now, and you really can't get it out. So it's not the pathogens, not the parasites, it's the pharmaceuticals. So that's really too bad. But the fact is, this was an example. No one sat down and designed, and said, oh, we need to use the human waste for, fertilizer. It's just like, hey, little by little, and it grows and became this fundamental system. And it so much so that it was in humor, it was in stories, it was in not just human solid waste, but also urine as well. Yes. Was also valuable. And they were careful to have their toilets to segregate those if possible. And there's a funny story of these two guys traveling from Edo to Osaka. And this guy shows up at an inn and says, hey, I have a jug of piss. If I give you this, will you give me a room for the night? and the fact is that this is not a ridiculous idea at the time, So, this is really a funny thing. So, yeah. So there's that. And you talk about washing, one main thing is they didn't really use what we'd call is soaps or cleansers or those things. It was done more through abrasives and through other things. And washing the body, the human body, of course, there was so many things that centered on it. It's a very hygienic culture, and people took a lot of baths even back then. So one wonderful thing that I learned about was that like in the summer, they would put a big jar of water out in the sun, and it would heat up. And in the evening, you'd wash off with that. And that was actually, it's not piping hot, but plenty warm enough to feel comfortable and have a good wash down with. So that was just very, very common. Pardon?
Washing clothes?
For clothes, it was also, there's so many aspects to it. But again, people would wash it, but they weren't using really soaps or anything. And the thing about Japanese clothes is that they can be taken apart. So this was, the whole clothing thing. This is a modular system, that's what is called a tanmon, this very long strip of woven cloth that was basically used for clothing without actually wasting any of it. So if you look at Japanese kimono, it's all these rectangular pieces, and those could be taken apart for cleaning, etc. But, again, the farmstead basically used gray water for a lot of things, and basically didn't waste the gray water, and it wasn't full of poison to begin with. You could use whatever was coming from the kitchen or the other place, and that would go into the pond at the farmstead, and that would be used for other uses. And in the urban areas, of course, again, clothing, there was this massive recycled clothing market. I mean, people were very accustomed to sort of trading in the clothes they're tired of wearing for something that was used and maybe, more fashionable or maybe just suited them. And then also fashions that came from patching together different pieces of fabric into some jazzy, collage of color. So this whole clothing aspect was also very, 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 very different. And all these things, of course, they're just connected. It's all integrated into a system. One thing I wanted to point out is, in terms of hygiene and health, cotton was introduced basically right before this period. We talked about bedding and futons. Before they started growing cotton, which was introduced from outside of Japan, people would just sort of sleep in a pile of straw, and that wasn't very good. And they would have like one set of clothes, it was generally made of flax and basically other linen, vegetable fibers. And it was very, very valuable and very, very expensive. But the introduction of cotton and cotton farming, which was promoted by the government initially to clothe soldiers, and they realized you could wash this in very, very hot water. Because the other textiles would break down under very, very hot water. So you could wash it in hot water, and that was very, very hygienic. So this was a kind of revolution that revolutionized clothing itself and also bedding. That's where the cotton futon bedding really, really started to become common among people of all classes. So this was an example where the government said, yes, we need more cotton, and they would provide incentives and publish, guidebooks for the farmers to learn how to grow it. And of course, literacy was much more common in the urban areas, but these guidebooks are beautifully illustrated. Really, you look kind of like I tried to do in my book. You look at the pictures and you can figure out what's going on. So this just allowed that to affect everybody's, well-being throughout the entire nation. So again, these things are all connected, but the idea of washing without poisoning the water is a very important part of that.
Can I just break in and ask a little question?
Sure.
I'm thinking through all of that. I really enjoyed dyeing fabric with indigo in Japan, and I was thinking of the story about the urine in the jug, and how urine is often used as a fixative for various dyes. In fact, I'm growing woad at the moment, and I'm
really?
storing up my urine to do exactly that as it happens. But one of the things that struck me when I was reading Just Enough, and that I'd really love to ask Sue about, is the parallels between the homestead of the firstborn son and what you're doing at Meliodora, and leading on from everything that Azby's just said and going through all the different systems. I was sort of more trying to get in at the cooking stove point. I hadn't necessarily thought about going to the, human urine and whatever. But Sue, let us know what what are the parallels? What are the comparisons?
Well, the exciting thing is that, as I said, I aspire to lots of this simplicity stuff. It seems it's a bit harder in, the society we live in, and, you're trying to, especially since we're open to the public, etc., you're trying to influence more people. Like I've wanted human manure to be used in the gardens from day one. But that's only just happening now. But we do not use, the medicinals and the chemicals that go through the human body to make it so that we wouldn't be able to use it. But David's concern was always that, well, we have a lot of people coming through here and we don't know exactly what they've been eating and doing.
I was thinking of other things like, in the chapter about the homestead of the firstborn son, there's a lot of things like reusing warm water for purposes to warm things, or reusing the nutrients coming from grey water, or things like ventilation and how ventilation was used in houses. And I know you have a cool cupboard that uses exactly that. So it's there seem to me to be not necessarily. I mean, I know the Aurori is as an interesting, like the hearth is an interesting concept, but in the house at Meliodora, there's a lot of parallels with the various technologies and things in that chapter of Just Enough. And I don't know if you're interested to compare, or if I'm putting you on the spot too much for that particular chapter. Or...
No. I'm liking the fact that you're drawing out those things, because I've been so focused in what we're getting out of the Edo period that I can't possibly think at the minute of the things that, we're doing similarly, apart from hearing Azby talk, and I'm thinking, we do some of those things, and all the edge things we try and focus on, like using as little active in the way of systems, driven by electricity or whatever other means as possible, and Cool Cupboard being one of those things, which I like very much. All these things are not something that you're giving up, I want to emphasize. It's a joy to use all these things, and to know that you don't have to go out and get cash to pay for all those things on an ongoing basis. Like the Cool Cupboard is a convection drawn cool cupboard where the air flows through from below the floor level through a cupboard and up out of a flue pipe, and it has baskets in it where you can store all the different things. And especially I like it for eggs and cheese, things like that, because they are at an ideal temperature rather than having them at a fridge temperature. The other things that I like are our storage drawers that we have for our grain, because we have a mill for milling grain to make bread or whatever, and that means that you can store a very large quantity of your grain and then use it just over the season, and you can actually buy a year's worth of grain, and the best option would be to get it straight off the field so the farmer doesn't have to store it so much. And so we also do bulk foods for that reason. I like to store a lot. We have 44-gallon drums in a nice shady area in the barn, so that we can supply other people as well over the period. Those sorts of things make you feel very resilient as well, and I think that's a very important thing that we've learnt from Edo too. The resilience factor has been brought to us courtesy of a very small virus, which has been nice from looking at it from the positives point of view. That, in lockdown we've had to have more we've had to have more storage and to think about being at home more. What other things?
Well, one of the things we put in the Retrosuburbia book is our grey water system, which is a series of 3 baths, a worm farm, a horizontal flow reed bed and open water pond. But it depends importantly on what goes in at the top end, because there's no big grease trap to sort of take out all the material. And the way Sue uses, minimally uses oils and fats for frying, minimum amount of that in the cooking, and then things like a pan being put up for use the next day, rather than trying to dissolve that with
if we have a roast, for example, you'll have the fat left in the bottom. That's a precious resource. There's no way I'm going to put a soap in it and put it down the sink. So I would cook, say, rice or something in that, and then you're left with nothing in the bottom. And the idea that you lick your plate is very encouraged in our household. You get 10 points if you lick your plate.
So I'm trying to remember whether we've ever had to clean out the S-trap.
Yeah, we just did it recently.
That's right, yeah.
Twice we've done it in over 30 years.
And need to point out that the kitchen at our place has probably had as much use as a big commercial catering kitchen. So that, yeah, minimal food doesn't go down the sink at all. And that using a piece of newspaper to wipe out a pan and that going in to start the next fire. So
we used to do that. We don't. That's extravagant. You've got to use it all.
So Sue is right into these definite minimalist approaches, and those things connect to the viability of the technology you're using. So certainly our grey water system with standard household behaviour probably wouldn't cope. It wouldn't be an adequate design to be able to cope with the loads of what people typically put into grey water.
The Japanese are very good at washing in cold water, which means you don't have all the fats that require soaps, etc. I saw that a lot in Japan. They're also very good at using every little bit of everything in the kitchen, you know, whatever comes out of the garden. You use the top of the carrot. You use the little furry leafy bit for one thing, and you use the stem for another. You make a lot of little dishes. And the Japanese in traditional society were never fat. Low center of gravity, strong, not these great big bean poles that are overfed with protein, etc., etc. I learned so many things in Japan, but I also felt like a coming home to those. Using a small towel for your washing, you rinse off, and then you get in your water, and you can keep that for longer.
Right.
That's still in modern day Japan. And
do you know about the pumps in the washing machines to take the water from the bath to do the washing?
Yes.
This is still like 60% of, they're built into every Japanese washing machine, and about 60% of households use the bath water to wash the clothes.
Yeah.
And it's only possible, like you said, because the bath water is kept fairly clean because people are washing outside first. This is very, very common. To me, that's a very Edo way of thinking that still persists.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was just thinking about the washing machine and how that's one thing that I have chosen really to keep. You know, washing the dishes, no problem. Washing the clothes, thank you very much. I'll have a washing machine. So that thing is that we don't use the bath, which we could use for washing and then recycle that water out. Although we do have a fire bath. I don't know how to hook up the washing machine to the fire bath. I'll have to think about that one. Maybe there are...
Good project.
There's a way.
Good project. One more thing. You were talking about, your cool cupboard, and this reminds me that Japanese houses, since, centuries ago and even today, often have underfloor storage. which
Yes,
serves a
sure.
similar need. And what's kept in there are things like miso or, umeboshi, pickled plums and things like that. And I was visiting, I've been researching in an area in Western Japan, an area called Izumo, and visited a beautifully restored samurai house. And that house had an entire storage room for miso and fermenting things. And that just reminded me that, one of the brilliant developments in Japan, of course, this is common in many places, was finding ways to preserve and use food without needing energy to cook it or prepare it to eat. So fermentation, pickling, other kinds of storage, like that, was just so common. They wouldn't have survived without having been able to do that. So, and again, they're all connected. And I thought, wow, this house has a whole room for this stuff. Kind of was eye-opening. And it was a samurai house, so.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, that's another thing that has been become very popular. Fortunately, I think, is the fermenting of foods.
Yeah.
Even though it's gone, as often these new fads do, oh, I want this ferment, that ferment, so I'll go and buy all these things out of season and make a ferment out of them. But, it's part of the great thing of Japanese cooking is the fermented foods for gut health and digestion. And in the modern era, we all have some gut problems, even if it's only from overeating.
Yeah. And of course, these things, were used in moderation. I mean, this, a little bit of pickles along with, your rice and your other stuff. And as you said, Japanese, the diet was considered nearly ideal. And as you know, until the modern period, almost no meat consumed. And this was partly for Buddhist reasons, but also because they didn't want to devote the agricultural land, which is very limited, to grazing cattle. So they would eat it, but meat would be more likely to be wild boar or deer or something like that. Beef was a fairly recently, really post-war period where under American influence it became a common part of the diet. But fish, fish was always part of the diet. And these were, locally caught. And we were talking earlier as well, in terms of provisioning the city, basically the farmers were able to walk from their farm to the market in the city. They leave early morning, maybe, 2, 3 a.m. and arrive in the morning. This was a natural sort of food mile, let's say restriction. Other things like grain, rice could be shipped from greater distances as some other desired products, but basic food stuff, it had to be grown close by. And again, that also close enough for them to cart that poop from the latrines back to their farm as well. So
this is
and fish was caught basically in Tokyo Bay, which is now Edo Bay, Tokyo Bay. Really, it was not going out huge distances to catch in the middle of the ocean. It was caught pretty much generally within sight of shore, and very carefully regulated to avoid overfishing as well. So, yeah.
In terms of those landscape relationships, Azby, I saw your diagrams that you used to explain that sort of catchment relationship, and I saw some similarities with the essay I wrote recently, Feeding Retrosuburbia from the Backyard to the Bioregion, and looking at that nested zoning of what things could be produced in an Australian city in different scales, and what were the relationships with the hinterland region.
Is that a new essay or book?
Yeah, it's an essay on the Retrosuburbia website.
Yeah, I'd like to see it. I've seen some of your other writing. I'd like to see that because we need that thinking. And
it was written,
and again, it's all about how they connect, right?
It was written for people who are doing the backyard food thing and just thinking about that question of what is appropriate for me to produce, and how could it be that we have a vision of a bioregional food system around a central city where most of the food came from within that sort of total system. And so it's really partly that inspiration that what people are doing at the backyard scale is part of a larger reformation.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'd like to see that. And again, once you sit down and try to diagram, and once you understand these things as systems, these integrated and actually fairly complex systems, you know, once you understand that and you can sort of diagram it, then you can see where you want to, you know, make things easier, reduce friction from this resource moving to here, or to actually site things to maximize other resources, whether it be water, whether it be sunlight, whether it be a quality of soil. So this is, yeah, it's important to have these kind of basic analyses. And interestingly, you know, again, your work in permaculture gives us a very good theoretical basis for a lot of it. And people now studying, and including people that I've been mentoring, studying indigenous agriculture in different parts of the world, whether it's, you know, Sikkim in India or Zimbabwe in Africa. There's a lot to learn. A lot of similar approaches, and basically that evolved because of the sort of constraints on resources and resource use. So that this society is developed in. So, you know, now we just have this thinking, like you said earlier, we just assumed for 500 years, we just keep getting more stuff when we need it. Go somewhere else and get it, you know? Obviously, it's not really working, is it?
No.
So, yeah.
So I think that just to sum all that up, in the foreword of Just Enough, there's this little image of the stone. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is a picture of a stone basin at a wonderful Zen temple. It's very well known, called Ryo-Anji in Kyoto. And this is one that has a beautiful rock garden with like 7 stones in a big field of white gravel. And to one side of the temple building that faces that garden is this stone basin. And the characters say, ware tada taru o shiru, which, and it's designed in a way where it's kind of a puzzle. You can read it in different ways, but it basically means all I'm concerned about is having enough, or having enough is the only thing to be concerned about. And this is, you know, what inspired the title of the book, was Just Enough. In this particular case, this is in a Zen Buddhist context, which of course Zen Buddhism is about restraint and is about getting rid of inessentials and somehow discovering, you know, a core, a pure core to life. And a lot of Japanese culture, these very simple designs that are still influencing things today, come from Zen culture. And the Zen culture also very strongly influenced the samurai and that whole culture of restraint, etc. So that was a real big inspiration. And it was fascinating because I, you know, made the drawing, did the book, and then, you know, especially when the Japanese one came out, I heard from so many Japanese, yes, that has been my motto, you know, for all my life. You know, that has been my motto.
That's what we need.
Yeah.
How do we, maybe we have to have our stones in some way to remind us, as the temples, you know, at the each roundabout with a garden in it or something with the...
Yeah. A motto. It's a motto. It's a motto. It's a proverb. It's a reminder. And at the same time, you know, that's one way that things can speak to us and teach us, literally with a few words. And of course, it's a beautiful basin. It's water. It has all this stuff. But everything else speaks to us as well. And I think what you're doing there speaks to a lot of people. Simply the reality of it. See there, experience it. You know, you go, you meet people. You know, you see how things are in the landscape, how they fit with the environment, and that is one way that we learn. So, and can be left for future generations as well. So, and I'm very concerned about leaving something for future generations, and I'm sure you are as well.
What a fantastic point to conclude on.
Yeah.
What an amazing discussion.
Yeah.
This is great. I feel like we've only started.
Yeah, we need to make a monthly one.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah,
maybe so.
Another month.
I'd be happy to. I'd be happy to. So much to talk about, and we could.
Maybe there's a joint book in store.
There may be. I'm totally open to that idea as well. And there's, as we know, and you know, other people. I was mentioning people researching in other parts of the world. There's a lot of people with a lot of stories to tell, and that are all things we can learn from. So.
Wow.
And you get me a magic carpet so I can come back to Japan.
Yes, well, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks when you do.
I'm looking for something to rub. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you so much for organising
No,
this.
thank you all.
It's been a
Thank you
delight
all.
for us
This
all.
was great, very serendipitous, and yeah, happy that. And what we didn't mention is that, you know, I got to know Virginia because of my work dealing with the Fukushima disaster and meeting her husband Stephen in this radiation safety protection context.
Yes.
So that's really fascinating.
And I wouldn't have your book had it not
Yes,
been Virginia bringing it.
there you go. So fascinating, good fortune for all of us. So.
Part of my remit to say thank you to all of you and to kind of direct everybody to various websites, and particularly the Permaculture Australia website, and to spruik our new t-shirts. Hopefully people will buy for Christmas presents, along with the various masks I've been making for those of us still
lots of mask
in the
making.
COVID world. But yeah, look, thank you.
Until the winter.
What's that?
I think we can put the masks aside until winter.
I wish we could. Yeah. Unfortunately, we're still under instructions to wear them.
People wear them here with even just the small. People don't need much convincing to wear masks here.
No, that's so true.
No, yeah. And I think it's a kind of a case of it's a kind of a friendly gesture in Japan. If a person has a cold, they cover themselves so they don't give it to other people in the it's
consideration.
Spaces.
It's about consideration.
Yeah. So that's the way to think about it. Not so much, oh, that person over there is wearing a mask. You know, I might get something from them. It's that you keep your germs to yourself.
Yeah.
You're protecting other people.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Another lesson. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you all very much. David Holmgren and Su Dennett and Azby Brown, author of Just Enough. And we look forward to seeing you again sometime, maybe.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.